really wondering, because this particular message might get me into some pretty hot water. Not just with everybody here, but may get me into some hot water with myself. After all, you are looking at a pastor who, on the one hand, wants to be able to follow after God, and yet on the other hand also holds a black belt in martial arts, so it's kind of hard to be able to turn the other cheek if you know how to block that. So really, we have to be able to get and dig down deep into what this passage is getting at. And I pray, and it is my heart's prayer, that we would be able to walk away from this knowing exactly what Jesus wants us to hear today. And so to do that, I've got to be able to do like we usually do, and I'm going to take everybody back to the historical situation that Jesus and his followers were facing. You see, their world is a little bit different from ours. They lived in an occupied territory. We don't necessarily struggle with that. We don't look outside of our windows and see troops from a foreign army walking down our streets. So it was an occupied world. The Roman Empire had invaded Palestine, had invaded where Jesus was at. And so you have to understand, picture yourself being in that particular context. Here's an empire with people that you don't know telling you what you can do and what you can't do. And so there was this desire for justice. There was this desire for freedom because there was no justice with the Romans, with Jesus' people. And so this burning question was there. This burning question that I think prompted Jesus to give this teaching, and the burning question among Jews of his day, can I use personal revenge to get justice? If I can't find justice with the Romans, if I can't find justice with the courts, am I allowed to use revenge to get personal justice? And so this led to militia movements, and it really created this pressure cooker situation in Jesus' day. They're wanting this Messiah. They're wanting this military leader that's going to overthrow the Roman Empire, and in walks Jesus with this teaching. I'm sure perked up a few ears. So why is Jesus saying this? Well, to understand what Jesus' words mean for us today, we got to go back into the Old Testament law that he was talking about. And so the Old Testament, what it was supposed to establish was this thing in Latin called lex talionis, and basically what that just means is the law of retaliation. The law of retaliation. But the trick of this is this law was only given to judges. It was only given to people who were trusted to desire to give justice to others. This wasn't meant for everybody to start enacting their own justice towards others. Even the great King David, do you remember his story when Saul would chase him? Even David recognized, I'm not in an authority to go after Saul because I'm not a judge. So even David had to show kindness and mercy to Saul, and he did multiple times. David even recognized, I can't do the eye for an eye because I'm not a judge. And this eye for an eye was given so that the punishment would fit the crime. It was supposed to be a deterrent. Some societies back whenever this law was given, they went too far. They said, well, you knocked out this person's eye so their family gets to kill you. A little extreme, if you ask me. But basically what this was meant to do is to make the punishment fit the crime. So if you've lost something, or if this person took something from you, they had to pay it back in so many amounts. That's exactly what Jesus is getting at. It's meant to be a deterrent, and it's meant to actually show mercy. It's meant to show mercy. So if you have two families, the Hatfields and McCoys, and they're squabbling back and forth with each other, this law was supposed to come in and go, okay, how much are you owed? You pay them. How much are you owed? You pay them. And there's the justice. There's the justice. That's why this law was given. Not for personal vengeance. Not so that if somebody hurt me, I'm allowed to go, okay, what do they owe me? Now I'm coming after them and getting mine. And interestingly enough, this law may be given thousands of years ago, but we still struggle with that same desire today, don't we? This person did this to me, now I'm going to get them back. And I'm only going to do what they did to me. But if you notice, that never really worked. take a little bit more, that'll alert him. Take a little bit more, that'll show him not to mess with me. That desire for justice is there, and we're going to get to it later. But this law was not given for personal vengeance, because if we return evil for the evil done to us, then we're all made evil, and the law is dissolved. And by Jesus' day, this had become a problem. This had become a problem. There was a constant infighting. There was constant asking this question, where am I allowed to take my personal revenge on somebody? And so Jesus has to reinterpret and give a pronouncement about this law that had been given in good motives, but had been abused by so many because they were taking it out of the hands of the justices and they were starting to do it themselves. So in walks Jesus with the true pronouncement of this law, and this is what he's saying. He's using a hyperbole. He's using language meant to get our attention. And so we have to get what Jesus is getting at here, because we can't miss the forest by looking at one tree. We've got to get the overarching point of why Jesus has given us this law. And the reason he's given us this law is so that we can avoid evil by doing good, even to our enemies. And that grates against all of us, I know that. It's easy. We talked about this in Sunday school. It's easy to have that emotional gut check reaction against somebody. It's much more difficult to sit down and go, all right, I'm choosing to not get the revenge. And it's even more difficult to say, I'm going to actually show mercy to this person. So what exactly is Jesus getting at? Let's set the stage here. When Jesus is talking about resisting, he's not necessarily saying that if somebody's wailing on you, you're not allowed to defend yourself. Jesus also isn't saying that if a crime was committed against you, you can't go to the law courts and say, okay, I need to have justice done here, because there needs to be that process of reconciliation. And Jesus certainly isn't saying that if the person comes to you and asks you for your forgiveness, you're supposed to say, oh no, you haven't paid enough to me yet. What Jesus is saying about here, what he's saying with resisting, is answering violence with violence. What Jesus is getting at here when he says resisting is not going to the courts and saying, you know what, this person stole $5, but I'm wanting to react revenge. I want you to take $500 from him and pay me back what's owed to me. That's what Jesus is getting at here. And so he uses these very, very specific hyperbolic examples for this, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at each one of them. He says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. So, back then in Jesus' day, if you were to give somebody the old backhand, the old 5 across the eyes, that was seen as a dishonor. That was seen as an insult back then. That was seen, if you were somebody's master and they were a slave, it was like a, remember your place, you. It was seen as a sign of great dishonor. And so when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, he's calling us to sacrifice pride. Whenever he talks about cloaks, he says if someone wants to sue you, take your tunic, give them your cloak as well. The cloak back then was something that everybody had. Everybody had back then. And interestingly enough, you weren't allowed to take somebody's cloak. You could borrow it with the pledge that you gave it back to them. So if somebody, let's say, owed you money, and you wanted to say, okay, but I need you to pay me back this money, this person could give you their cloak as a token. But by the end of the day, you had to give it back to them, because if that's all they own, how are they going to sleep? What blanket are they going to use? And so Jesus is actually doing something rather bizarre here, because he's saying, you know something? Even in the law courts, if somebody isn't allowed to take your cloak and it's a slam dunk case in your favor, if this person wants to sue you and take the tunic, give them the cloak. Jesus is calling us to sacrifice personal materialism. He says if somebody goes with you 1 mile, don't be afraid to go the 2nd mile. And interestingly enough, there is an example of this when Simeon is called to carry Jesus' cross. At at the end of the Gospels. Because back then, any Roman soldier could pick you out of the crowd and go, you know what? I don't feel like carrying my bags 1 mile. You have to carry all of it, and you weren't allowed to say anything. And yet Jesus calls us to go the extra mile in that case. He's calling us to sacrifice. He's calling us to even sacrifice our comfort, to even sacrifice a little bit of that liberty. Because honestly, many Jews back then wanted revolt. Many of them wanted freedom. Many of them wanted the status quo. Nobody wanted this. And Jesus even says, don't be afraid to loan to those who can't pay back. And interestingly enough, the Bible stressed giving to those in need and God would take care of them. The Bible stressed giving to those in need and God would take care of them. There was even this law against usury that says you couldn't charge somebody exorbitant interest. And what Jesus was actually addressing in that is people, this is how this would work back then. Every 50 years there was a law of Jubilee. Every 50 years, whatever debt you had towards somebody was forgiven. And so think about it. Some people at year 49, they might try to get wise. They might try to say, oh, you know, maybe I can get a little bit from this person and they can't collect the debt anyways. Jesus is saying, you know what, even in that situation, loan the money to the person. Loan the money to the person. Be generous. Be generous. He's calling us to sacrifice property. So pride, personal materialism, comfort, a little bit of liberty, and even property rights. Now you know why I was afraid to preach this. Jesus was calling for a surrender. A surrender. But think about it. If we give up the materialism, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? What can that property really give us? Jesus is calling us to value relationships as the top priority, to act out of unselfish love, to do good even to our enemies. For think about this, if my neighbor's house is on fire, and if I bring gasoline, does that put the fire out? No. If my enemy's house is on fire and I bring kindling, does that put the fire out? What puts the fire out? Water. The opposite of fire. You try to cure evil with more evil, it doesn't work. You have to bring good to it. You have to bring the opposite of evil to evil. You have to bring good. And the evil person can only be overcome with the good. Jesus is telling us to do good even to those who wrong us. For a Christian's desire is to be loving and to be forgiving. To be like Jesus. And I admit, this isn't natural. This isn't natural for any of us. It's not natural to do good to those who have hurt us. But that's what makes the relationship that we have with Jesus that much more important. It's only through having that relationship with Him that we can even do good to the people who have wronged us. It's only by having that relationship with Him that we don't desire to seek revenge on somebody. I know, brothers and sisters, I've told you this before. If somebody's hurt you, and if all you can do is just to pray with them through clenched teeth, and the only thing you can pray for them is, Lord, I really pray that a piano doesn't fall on their head big. Start off small. Start off small, and what I have noticed is God will do a work in you. And even though it starts off frustrated, eventually He will fill you with more and more of His love, of His grace, and of His mercy to the point, and it may take years down the road, but God will bring you to a point where you will start to genuinely care about this person. And you might never be buddies with them, don't get me wrong there. But God will bring you to a person where at the very least, you don't want to see any harm come to them. God will bring you to a point where you don't want to see harm come to them. And Jesus grounds this perfection in God. And it's one where we have that relationship with God, and therefore we should be acting like God. Do good to those who hate you so that you don't get poisoned by that hatred yourself. For a disciple's first responsibility is to actually reverse the dynamic, not to take, but rather to give. And so this is what Jesus is getting at with each one of these examples. When he talks about turning the other cheek, what Jesus is saying is that, you know what? You smacked me with an undignified slap. I'm going to turn you the other one, so if you're going to hit me again, you're going to treat me like an equal. Jesus is saying, you don't have to worry about this person robbing whatever dignity you think you have, because you have a God-given dignity that nobody can take away. When Jesus calls us to give up our tunic and our cloak, he's talking to us about shaming the evil. For think about it. If somebody strikes me on the one cheek and they're actually going to have the audacity to turn and hit me the other also when I offer it to them, that's wrong. Very few people are actually going to do that back in Jesus' day because it was shameful. Jesus says if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic and you give them your cloak, guess what? That makes them look like a jerk. And it makes them look like a bully. You're shaming the evil. You're doing good and shaming the evil. When Jesus says to go that second mile, think about it. If a Roman soldier picked you out of the crowd and you go, oh, but I'll go with you the 2 miles, that makes the Roman soldier look weak, doesn't it? All this is strategy. All this is strategy. And when Jesus calls about giving, even to those who can't repay, even to an enemy of you, he's calling us to exemplify God, who gave everything to us even though we were once enemies of him. For if you loan to those only who love you, what reward is that? Jesus is freeing us to be generous. Jesus is saying, don't worry so much about the material possessions that you can't bear to part from them. Instead, be free to give. Jesus says, don't worry so much about your honor that you're not willing to suffer a little bit in order to serve. But what Jesus is doing by each one of these things is by your goodness and your God-given integrity, you're going to shame the evil. You're going to shame the evil, and guess what? You won't have to act evil to do it. It's to serve those around you, deserving and not, because God does. Those who have been shown mercy and have received that mercy, so also give that mercy. And honestly, brothers and sisters, you may think this doesn't work in the real world, but really, it does. Take a look at some of the non-violent protests that have happened in the last 100 years. Take a look at how people have been convicted by innocent suffering that refuse to retaliate. People who would watch that going on were convicted of this and saying, I can't sit by and do nothing. And so people were swayed and people were changed. I've often thought of the different movements that have been nonviolent and peaceful. It actually shames the evil and it convicts people who are watching, and it says, you know, if these people are willing to suffer for something that they believe in, whatever that may be, that goodness reaches out and touches people. It reaches out and touches people. And serving those who have offended you often leads to their conviction. Did you ever think about that? Serving those who offend you actually leads to their conviction because they realize something. They realize you are filled so much with God-given dignity. This person isn't going to hurt you. That's the reason why, you know, I know what it's like to suffer bullying in my life, okay? It was bad. Most of us have been there. But you want to know something? If you do good to the bully who's hurt you, the bully doesn't have any power over you anymore, does he? Nope. You're choosing to still do goodness to him. You've stripped him of his power over you. You've stripped him or her of that power that they tried to have over you because you're choosing to do good to them. And guess what? People like that, they have a real come to Jesus moment because they realize, oh, I can't hurt this person anymore. I can't hurt this person anymore because they've chosen to do good to me. And I guarantee you this, very many individuals have come to know Jesus that way. Very many people have come to know Jesus that way. The reality of God's grace in you may woo others into the kingdom. Serving others and living in the kingdom of God daily challenges us. If you're a police officer or a soldier, it calls us to make value judgments, to obey God rather than men, to judge what is right and wrong from God's perspective, even if they find themselves having to break an unjust law. So you might be asking yourself, Pastor, this is all well and good, but how do I bring this into my day? Does this mean that Jesus didn't care about justice whenever we've been wronged? Far from it. Justice is just as much a part of Jesus' ministry as love is. Because this sermon today is not mere moralization. I'm not trying to come to you and say, you know what, you were genuinely hurt, but you still got to do good to those who are around you. No. Jesus isn't being that condescending towards us. What he's doing here, though, is he's trying to get us to see the bigger picture. He's trying to get us to see the forest and not focus on one tree. Because if this were mere moralizing, that's shallow. It must run deeper. It must run based on who God is. So I'll tell you what, just so that none of us think Jesus could ever be guilty of hypocrisy, when he tells us to turn the other cheek, he's not doing something he wasn't himself willing to do. He turned the other cheek, and he kept turning and kept turning and kept suffering and taking on more and being, leaving the presence of his Father and taking on flesh and walking among us, and kept lowering himself even to wash feet, and lowering himself to touch out those who were hurting, and lowering himself to even die on a cross. Jesus is not asking us to do something that he wasn't willing to do. When Jesus talks about if someone wants to see you to take your tunic, give him your cloak too, Jesus was born poor. Jesus didn't have much to his name, and yet whatever he did have, he gave. He died penniless, broke, shamed, nothing. He gave it all. When Jesus talks about if someone wants to take you 1 mile, go with him the 2nd mile, Jesus went that 2nd mile, and that 3rd mile, and that 4th mile, and it led him right up to the hill on Calvary on the cross. And when Jesus talks about loaning and being generous and being giving, he gave it all. Not money, but he gave his very life when he died for us. Jesus calls us to embody that. Not to repay evil for evil, but following him. Refusing to fight evil with evil, instead fighting evil with good. To be an example to others, to bring both us and our enemies under the yoke of God's love. Jesus took the pain, and he died for it. And he died even for the pains of the nations. You may have pain. People may have wronged you. It happens to all of us. But take comfort. Jesus died for that too. And on the cross, he judged the sin. Because I know what all of us in here are thinking. Pastor, that's all well and good, but I still want my justice. I still want to see justice served. Even if it wasn't something done to me, I still want that justice served for things and the sufferings that I see out in the world today. But you know what? God's gave you that too. That's why we have to take a look at him. Let God be the one to judge. His ways are perfect.